I watched a video called How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit by a couple of guys who modestly refer to themselves as a film school, Rocket Jump Film School. And Rocket Jump's video inspired me to make this video, in which I'll try to answer questions like, is Rocket Jump's video actually any good? And why does it suck? So let's all matriculate, shall we? Here's Rocket Jump's first example of how Star Wars was saved in the edit.
The film always began with the famous opening crawl. The text itself in earlier drafts was long. Really long.
Did you catch that? I didn't the first time around, but I did notice that the planet over which the opening battle takes place is named as Utapau, not Tatooine, and I wondered if this was actually a page from the shooting script for Star Wars. This page, presented in Rocket Jump's video, is from the third draft for Star Wars, dated August 1st, 1975. The shooting script for Star Wars was the revised fourth draft, dated March 15th, 1976. Rinzler's book contains a summary of every draft of Star Wars up to and including the shooting script, showing the progression of the story from earliest concept to finished film. In the summary of the third draft, this text appears. In the summary of the fourth draft, this text appears. And in the summary of the revised fourth draft, the shooting script, this text, which as you can see is very close but not identical to the fourth draft version and matches Peter Mayhew's shooting script word for word, does not appear. Instead, Rinzler simply writes, "The roll-up is the same as in the third draft." Later in Rinzler's book, this photo appears with a caption that identifies this as being the third draft version of the crawl, but it's not. It is word for word the revised fourth draft version. This clip, which you catch the briefest glimpse of in Rocket Jump's video, meant to represent the crawl that Spielberg, De Palma, and others saw at that mid-February '77 rough cut screening is, in fact, word for word the shooting script version, not the third draft version of the crawl. But according to Paul Hirsch, the opening prologue was still the one from the third draft, about what happens in the 100 years before the film, but Brian and Jay felt it should be explaining what happened right before the film starts. When they were putting together the rough cut, they shot a temporary version of the crawl based, for whatever reason, on the third draft of the script. Lucas showed De Palma the shooting script version, and De Palma rewrote it. Months later, the shooting script version of the crawl was shot, and then it was reshot, incorporating De Palma's changes. So I contacted the author of Making of Star Wars, J.W. Rinzler, who confirmed to me that these are errors in the book, which will be corrected in the next edition. That the roll-up in the shooting script is, in fact, the same as that of the fourth draft, not the third. And he said that he believed it would have been the shooting script version of the crawl used in the rough cut. Either way, the crawl in the finished film is not De Palma's rewrite of the third draft crawl, but rather Lucas's rewrite of De Palma's rewrite of Lucas's rewrite of his rewrite of the third draft crawl. It makes much more of an impact on the audience if you simply compare the third draft version of the crawl to the final. The difference in the word count between the two is 83 words, whereas the word count difference between the shooting script and the film version is only 32 words. And if you compare the content, it's mostly the same. The one substantive difference being that the audience are informed about the stolen plans to the Death Star rather than find out over the course of the film. The narrative of Rocket Jump's video is extremely simple and is essentially told before the title appears and the video proper even begins. It goes like this. George Lucas made Star Wars and then showed it to his friends. They hated it. The movie was a disaster.
But the film was not beyond saving.
So Lucas hired 3 brilliant editors, Marcia Lucas, Richard Chew, and Paul Hirsch, and they saved the film. The end. The first of many problems with this narrative is that this disastrous cut of the film to which Lucas's friends reacted so badly was in fact edited by Marcia Lucas, Richard Chew, and Paul Hirsch. And by February of '77, Marcia Lucas and Richard Chew had already completed their work on Star Wars. Complicates things a bit, doesn't it? Trust me, there will be plenty to say about this later. For now, let's get on to Rocket Jump's second example of how Star Wars was saved in the edit.
So far, so good. Everything was pretty much the same up until this happens.
Help! I think I'm melting. This is all your fault.
A little awkward place for a joke.
According to your video, in the script and in the rough cut of the film, this awkwardly placed joke immediately follows this shot. 3PO and R2 slowly waddling through the crossfire of the battle and not getting hit. It got a big laugh in the theater. Are you saying that when the droids start out on one side of the corridor, it's a fine time for comedy, but when they reach the other side of the corridor, 3 seconds later, it's suddenly become an awkward time for humor? And not to rocket to jump ahead.
That little awkward moment we saw at the beginning, which was later moved to after the TIE Fighter battle, as a way to relieve the tension by showing C-3PO look stupid.
Relieve the tension? What, you mean this tension?
That's it! We did it!
We did it!
The fight was over. The good guys won. They're celebrating and happy. Seems to me the tension was already relieved. Completely. See, I could argue that it would have made more sense to leave this joke where it was originally. In the final cut, 3PO and R2 are right next to each other, and then the very next time we see them, they're some distance apart, and 3PO has lost track of R2.
R2-D2, where are you?
And we don't know why. An awkwardly placed joke might have provided an explanation. This explosion knocks 3PO into this tangle of wires, and R2 gets ahead of him. This same joke coming after the dogfight doesn't really serve any purpose. It doesn't relieve tension. My point is, I think the joke works fine where it is, and I think it would have worked fine where it was originally too. It's just not really a big deal.
And then there's a scene transition to wherever this is. And who the heck is that? And what's he doing? Hopefully it's clear already that there's some problems with this. They just interrupted the pacing of this epic space battle to cut to some rando kid and his robot. The Star Destroyer is chasing Princess Leia's ship and is quickly captured. This is really how they're going to introduce their main character?
I know, it's insane. Instead of showing Luke working with a droid on the farm and then going to Tashi Station, we see him purchasing droids to work on the farm and then whining about going to Tashi Station.
But I was going into Tashi Station to pick up some power converters.
And who the heck is that? And what's he doing? Hopefully it's clear already that there's some problems with this.
Professor, because you may not know instantaneously who a character is and what they're doing when they first appear on screen, it doesn't mean that there's a problem necessarily.
Cutting a deleted scene is one thing.
Cutting a deleted scene. Wouldn't you say cutting a scene or deleting a scene, but not cutting a deleted scene, since the cutting of the scene is what makes it deleted?
However, the opening of the film intercut with Luke constantly.
Yeah, constantly. I mean, 3 times? That's once more than twice.
This scene was never intended to be Luke's introduction.
This was intended to be Luke's introduction. George Lucas talks about this on the commentary track to the film. This was an idea that I was enamored with that was used by Akira Kurosawa in the film Hidden Fortress, where you take the least important characters and you follow their story. And I really wanted to have the film be led by the droids, and when some friends of mine read the screenplay, they were adamant that I not do that. They thought making a film where in the first 20 minutes you're dealing primarily with just the droids would not work, but I loved the idea. Even though I shot those sequences, setting up Luke at the very beginning of the movie, I never liked it and I never wanted it in the movie, so I basically kept it the way I originally wrote it. The first cut of the film had the intercuts of Luke on the planet with what was going on in space, but it just wasn't the movie I wanted to make. This is corroborated in Dale Pollock's book that in the script, Lucas had the droids as the main characters at the beginning of the story, and 2 of Lucas's friends, Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood, suggested he change it, so Lucas rewrote the beginning, introducing Luke Skywalker earlier. A note Lucas made when developing the first draft of Star Wars in 1974, make film more point of view of robots. A later note when he was working on the second draft, whole film must be told from robots' point of view. A quote from Lucas about Matthew Robbins and Hal Barwood's suggestion that he add scenes with Luke in the beginning of the script. And that part that the professor presented at the end of his first Hirsch quote, that's actually from the text in the paragraph immediately following the Hirsch quote in Rinsler's book. George also felt there was no reason to see Luke until he became an active participant in the story. So, the professor was presenting George Lucas's reasoning as Paul Hirsch's reasoning. The professor seems to imply that the editors cut these scenes without George Lucas's approval, or even against his wishes, which would not have happened. But even if that were somehow the case, the scenes would almost certainly have made their way back into the film in subsequent releases if Lucas had wanted them in. And one last thing the professor left out of his video. Marcia Lucas fought to keep these scenes in the movie. Just as with The Crawl, I understand why the professor withheld so much information, because it fights his narrative. It makes it sound like the editors, especially Marcia Lucas in this case, weren't doing their job. And by that I mean, of course, their job according to Professor Jump.
Their job was to rebuild a bloated first act, cut tons of unnecessary material.
I guess 3 scenes with a combined running time of 5 minutes constitute tons of unnecessary material. Yes, these were the ones responsible for all of the bloating.
So why were those scenes cut? To put it simply, they're boring.
Alright, I've got to make sure everyone's following along. This was an awkward place for a joke, because Professor Jump said so. And these scenes are boring, because Professor Jump said so. You got that? Neither Lucas nor his editors offered this as a reason that the scenes were cut, so apparently the professor is under the impression that the scenes were cut because he finds them boring. By the time Spielberg, De Palma, and Lucas's other friends saw the movie, the scenes with Luke and his friends had been out of the picture for months.
Now we've seen how intercutting with Luke was completely unnecessary. Let's look at how intercutting was used to its fullest potential.
So, the professor has helpfully provided us with his conclusion to this section right at the top, framing everything that follows. He told us that we'll find that none of the scenes really seem to line up, and while we were wondering what he meant by that, he clarified that the Imperial scenes sort of feel thrown in at random.
In the final assembly, after R2 and 3PO are reunited, they cut to this, which is telling the audience automatically that these characters are still in immediate danger.
And I take it we're meant to infer that if the Luxor droid scene had occurred at any point other than this, it wouldn't have had the same effect. Did moving this scene really result in improvement? If so, why? And if not, why was the scene moved?
Luxor droids.
As opposed to cutting to the conference scene where you're given a whole slew of exposition about things that don't seem to be related at all to what's going on.
Remember this from the beginning of the film?
The Imperial Senate will not sit still for this. I'm a member of the Imperial Senate.
You are part of the Rebel Alliance and a traitor. Take her away!
Word of this gets out, it could generate sympathy for the rebellion in the Senate.
Another problem about keeping the conference scene here is that this would become the audience's first introduction to the Force, instead of hearing about it from Obi-Wan.
Professor, why is that a problem?
So by reshuffling these Imperial scenes, we get immediate payoffs to the scenes that preceded those.
If I understand correctly, you're saying that it's better to have payoffs closer to their setups, and the Luxor droid scene is an immediate payoff to the setup of 3PO and R2 reuniting on the Sandcrawler. But isn't the Luxor droid scene also a setup for the payoff of slaughtered Jawas and burning Homestead? Then by moving the Luxor droid scene as payoff closer to its setup, didn't the editors also simultaneously move this scene as setup further from its payoff?
So now the conference comes after we meet Obi-Wan, where we learn
Vader was seduced by the dark side of the Force.
Then we see that.
No, we don't. We see Vader use the Force to choke a guy. We see him seduced by the dark side in Episode 3.
We also learn that R2 has the stolen plans to the Death Star.
I have placed information vital to the survival of the rebellion into the memory systems of this R2 unit.
Followed by,
The plans you refer to will soon be back in our hands.
What Professor Jump is saying is that it is explicitly stated in the scene at Obi-Wan's house, setting up the dialogue in the conference scene, when exactly the reverse is true. In her message to Obi-Wan, Leia didn't say anything about plans or the Death Star. All she said was,
Information vital to the survival of the rebellion.
Whereas in the conference scene,
A complete technical readout of this station.
it is explicitly stated what R2 is carrying.
and it's not until after Luke and Obi-Wan meet Han Solo
Chewie here tells me you're looking for passage to the Alderaan system.
that we find out the Empire is going to the same place.
Set your course for Alderaan.
The truth is, the structural changes made to the section of the movie represented by this timeline are a lot simpler than he's made them sound, and a lot simpler than this makes them look. First, the professor has grouped the scenes on this timeline incorrectly. He has them grouped by faction, essentially good guy scenes and bad guy scenes, which has nothing to do with the story structure. They should have been grouped by location, what's happening on Tatooine and what's happening on the Death Star. In this section of his video, the professor talks about moving scenes around, but he doesn't say a word about sequences. What I'm getting at here is that just as you wouldn't want to interrupt a scene with another scene, the natural cutting away point would be between two sequences rather than in the middle of one. When you listen to Professor Jump's description of the structural changes made in this section, and when you see and hear this,
Okay, so here's where the editors made the biggest structural changes.
how many structural changes would you say the editors made? The answer is 2. The first is that the Death Star scenes have been pushed back, that is, not resequenced, they just occur later relative to what's happening on Tatooine. If we look at a timeline that's organized correctly, divided into the Tatooine A story and the Death Star B story, we see how incredibly simple the change really is. This is all that's happened. With one very minor exception, which we'll talk about in just a second, the scene order in the A story is unchanged, and the scene order in the B story is unchanged, and the points at which the movie cuts away from the A story to the B story are unchanged. Pushing the B story scenes back could be considered a significant change if the A and B stories were causally connected, but as I mentioned, they're not. So the change could be expressed like this. B used to happen before A, but now B happens after A, and whether B happens before or after A makes absolutely no difference to A, or B for that matter. So you may be wondering, if it makes no difference, why was the change made? I'll answer that in a moment, but first let's talk about the second of the 2 structural changes. If we refer to the scenes from the droid's arrival on Tatooine to their reunion on the Sandcrawler as Sequence 1, and the scenes from Luke's discovery of Princess Leia's message to the revelation of its meaning as Sequence 2, then the scene in which the stormtroopers locate the droid's escape pod, the Luxor droid scene, originally occurred in the middle of Sequence 2. This 12-second scene was moved to the natural cutting away point between Sequences 1 and 2, taking the position on the timeline previously occupied by the conference scene. If we look at the structural changes in conjunction as the conference scene being swapped out for the Luxor droid scene, and I were to speculate as to why the change was made, I might say because the conference scene is roughly 10 times as long as the Luxor droid scene, and with the earlier scenes of Luke and his friends having been cut, the change results in Luke being introduced a couple minutes earlier. But that would just be a guess. All I found that could potentially be seen as being in support of the idea is Richard Chu's statement that one of the big topics that came up was how do we speed up getting to the cantina scene, which ironically Chu cited as a contributing factor to the decision to cut the scenes with Luke and his friends at Tashi Station. Evidently, the conference scene and the other Death Star scenes were pushed back for a very different reason. A screening for Francis Ford Coppola resulted in the only structural changes. Francis thought that there was too much explanation in the beginning, I think Hirsch says, so we moved the first scene inside the Death Star to much later in the film, and once we moved that one scene down, it set off a whole chain reaction of other things that had to be shifted. This is what Hirsch is referring to, of course. What that accomplished was really terrific, Hirsch adds. Before, you had no idea of the relative importance of who these guys were. You didn't see the scene in its proper perspective. But once you'd followed Luke and picked up Ben, you knew how bad the bad guys were. The perspective to which Hirsch is referring that the audience has gained comes from scenes that would have followed but now precede the conference scene. That is, what the audience has learned is that Vader helped the Empire hunt down and destroy the Jedi, and that Vader betrayed and murdered Luke's father. Hirsch says that this explanation puts the conference in its proper perspective, which might make a bit more sense to me if, 1, the conference scene had been Vader's introduction, which it wasn't, we'd seen him before, or 2, if learning these things about Vader immediately before the conference scene in particular was necessary and or especially impactful. My question being, is it better to learn these things about Vader immediately before this scene, in which Vader tortures a random Imperial, or as it was originally written, immediately before this scene, in which Vader tortures one of our protagonists? My point is, I think that whether the Death Star scenes being pushed back resulted in improvement is debatable. And finally, the structural changes covered in this section of Rocket Jump's video were made simply because Coppola thought the beginning of the film was too exposition heavy.
So what about the Jabba and Vader scenes? Well, you don't need them. Both were cut from the released version, because all they do is repeat the same information the audience already knows.
That's true. Sort of. The Jabba the Hutt scene was not cut because it was unnecessary, it was made unnecessary because it was cut. That is, according to the making of Star Wars, the scene was cut because there wasn't sufficient time to complete the visual effects for it, and the exposition from the Jabba scene was then moved to the scene in which Greedo confronts Han Solo. That just leaves the Vader vamping scene, as Professor Jump calls it.
We already know this.
I want the rebels located and identified.
This is a minor point, but that line from Vader is actually from the Star Wars Holiday Special. That is, not the line that Vader was meant to deliver in this scene had it been included in the film.
Send in more troops if you have to. It's her hope that data being used against us, which is the pillar of her resistance to our mind probe.
Till then, we waste time.
To be fair, I suppose it is pointless to continually remind the audience that the characters are in danger.
Then there's the scene in Obi-Wan's house. Originally, the scene started with Luke and Obi-Wan watching the princess's message.
Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Then they play with lightsabers. And then they consider to go help her.
I need your help, Luke. She needs your help.
But upon viewing, as they describe in the making of Star Wars, this seemed a bit heartless because of the lag between her plea and their decision to fly and rescue her.
Something's sort of being glossed over here in regard to Obi-Wan and Luke's relatively slow response to Leia's plea seeming heartless. Something that's very easy to forget, but very important to remember. Obi-Wan's mission is not to rescue the princess. He doesn't know where she is or even if she's alive. Obi-Wan's mission is to bring a droid to Alderaan. At this point in the story, neither Obi-Wan nor Luke expected Alderaan to be destroyed by the Death Star.
I feel something terrible has happened.
They didn't expect Leia to be aboard the Death Star.
The princess, she's here?
They didn't even know that the Death Star existed.
He's heading for that small moon.
That's no moon.
Obi-Wan was never considering helping Princess Leia. His mind was made up the instant she told him what needed to be done. The only thing being considered was, what would Luke's part be in all this? Obi-Wan makes his decision, and it is the reason he gives Luke his father's sword. It is the reason he tells Luke about the Force and the Jedi, and the reason he tells Luke to come with him to Alderaan.
Alderaan?
It's all part of the same thing. Luke's call to adventure.
This shot of the heroes buckling their seatbelts was originally put right before the Falcon jumps to lightspeed. But again, it's kind of anticlimactic there.
If what the shot does is amp up the intensity of a chase, then the editors should have left it where it was originally, because in that context the heroes actually were being chased.
Some viewers had trouble understanding that Obi-Wan was going to shut down the tractor beam so they could escape.
The professor is referring to Brian De Palma and Matthew Robbins. De Palma and Robbins had trouble understanding that Obi-Wan was going to shut down the tractor beam, then by process of elimination, Willard Huyck, Gloria Katz, John Milius, Hal Barwood, Jay Cox, and Steven Spielberg had no trouble understanding it. And there's no reason that they should.
Even if I could take off, I'd never get past the tractor beam.
Leave that to me.
Also shot this insert for clarity. It's also weird to me that in the special edition, Lucas made this insert less helpful by translating the text to a fake Star Wars language, but whatever.
Lucas was making Episode 4 more consistent with the other films.
This entire sequence is truly breathtaking, and it's a remarkable feat of editing.
The professor opens this section with a play-by-play of the final battle as originally written, which seems unnecessary since the only difference between what he describes and what occurs in the finished film is that Luke does 2 trench runs. He could have simply said that Luke does 2 trench runs, but evidently he wanted to express it in a very specific way.
Then Luke does a run, and also fails. Then Luke does another run.
Luke does another run. I trust you understand the implication. So if you're wondering why 2 trench runs, I can only speculate, but if you have the hero attempt to accomplish something and fail, and then have him attempt to accomplish the same but under far more difficult circumstances, it maximizes tension. That is, in his second run, Luke loses his best friend, his other wingman, his R2 unit, and Darth Vader is about to destroy him.
Have you not?
If he failed the first time, there is no way he can succeed now. But Han Solo comes through, and rather than use the targeting computer, Luke trusts Obi-Wan and the Force, and that makes the difference.
Then Luke does another run, and finally succeeds. Kaboom. Good job. But here's the big difference. In that version, the Death Star wasn't about to destroy the Rebel base.
Before principal photography began on Star Wars, George Lucas had cut together a 10-minute sequence of aerial battles using footage from war movies. A precursor to animatics, the sequence was meant to be used by ILM as a guide for producing the visual effects for the Death Star battle. Essentially, he gave them moving storyboards. However, after Star Wars wrapped and Lucas returned from England, he found that ILM was over budget and behind schedule.
They had spent half their budget, and ultimately I had about 4 shots, none of which I would accept. They were just not good.
All of the visual effects for the escape from the Death Star sequence and the final battle were yet to be produced, so those sequences became the priorities in editing. Meaning, they couldn't afford to waste any time or money, and the time and money required to produce a given visual effects shot was directly proportionate to the length of the shot. So the editors needed to provide ILM with a work print of those sequences so they would know exactly how long each shot needed to be. Marcia Lucas was the first editor to work on Star Wars since Jimson, so George asked her to work on the Death Star battle so ILM could begin creating the visual effects as soon as possible. Lucas had Richard Chew assemble the escape from the Death Star sequence and then finished cutting it himself. According to Paul Hirsch, in the last few days of assembling the first cut, George, Richard, Marcia, and I would sit at the machine each for a couple of hours, taking turns and making suggestions. The last day we did this for about 12 hours. And all of this work resulted in a first cut that corresponded almost exactly with the shooting script, and included Luke's 2 trench runs.
The first thing she did was recut the trench run. This included removing Luke's first run.
Apparently not, Professor. Rinsler estimates that the first cut of the film was finished in late October or early November '76. Marcia Lucas left Star Wars in late November to edit New York, New York for Martin Scorsese. And evidently the work print for the battle was given to ILM a piece at a time beginning in mid-December. So it's possible that Marcia Lucas removed Luke's first trench run, and then again it's possible that she didn't. Professor Jump just assumes that she did. Even if we assume the same, we don't know if it was her idea to remove it, or Paul Hirsch's, or Richard Chew's, or George Lucas's. In his book A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away, Paul Hirsch says that each editor's work on the film was subject to review by the other 2, and claims that in fact it was he, not Marcia Lucas, who edited the latter portion of the final battle, beginning with the 3rd attempt to destroy the Death Star, Luke's first and/or only trench run. I'll talk about what else I learned from Hirsch's book at the end of the video. Even if we knew whose idea it was, that still wouldn't answer the important question, why was Luke's first trench run removed? All that's said in Rinsler's book is that the end battle was running too long. Running too long for what? Rinsler doesn't say. It is mentioned that there were doubts that the film would be finished on time, that compromises were made on the visual effects, that ILM went way over budget, that some ideas were abandoned because time and money were running out, and that removing Luke's first run made things much easier for ILM.
The Death Star was not about to destroy the Rebel base. It was literally just sitting there, waiting to be blown up. This is where Marshall Lucas came in, incorporating the idea that the Death Star was about to blow up the Rebel base.
Unlike with Luke's first trench run being cut here, the professor actually provides evidence that what he's saying is true. He points out that a bit of footage was repurposed,
like this shot here,
and offers a single unsourced out-of-context quote.
As Marshall Lucas puts it, it was all editorially manufactured. If you pay close attention, you'll notice that every single piece of footage that has to do with this idea is being delivered with off-screen dialogue over inserts.
Death Star will be in range in 5 minutes.
Or by reusing footage from other scenes.
More than once in this video, the professor says that the editors fixed a problem using inserts. I'm no filmmaker, but as I understand it, a master is typically a wide shot like this in which an entire scene can play out. A close-up of and/or angle on a specific character or characters within the scene is referred to as coverage, and an insert would be something like this, or this. So, in case you were thinking inserts were things that ingenious editors somehow fabricated from nothing or magically summoned from the ether, no, they're film footage. They're film footage like any other film footage. Footage that the editors had provided to them by this guy, the writer, director, producer. Shots of this display in the war room of the Rebel base would be considered inserts, but this display is also described in the shooting script, and there's a line of dialogue telling the audience that the Death Star is approaching the Rebel base. Right, so what was added along with a half a dozen cutaways to Peter Cushing was an accompanying verbal countdown.
Estimated time to firing range, 15 minutes.
And not just from the Rebels' point of view, but the Imperials as well.
The Rebel base will be in firing range in 7 minutes.
Is this an improvement? Something that Professor Jump seems to be ignoring is that Marshall Lucas was not a sound editor, and according to the information in both Pollak's and Rinsler's accounts, it seems very likely that when the voiceover work was done, Marshall was off editing New York, New York. Was the verbal countdown even Marshall Lucas's idea? The inclusion of a ticking clock element in the final battle, a countdown to the Death Star destroying the Rebel base. As it turns out, that was Paul Hirsch's idea. And the repurposing of footage of Peter Cushing just before the Death Star blows up? Well, that was Paul Hirsch's idea too. So, the reason Rocket Jump says that Star Wars was saved in the edit is...
because they say a film is written 3 times. First in the screenplay, next in production, and finally in the edit.
The implication being that the editors effectively rewrote Lucas's story. That's why the professor tries so very, very hard throughout his video to convince you that the story Lucas told in the screenplay and then in production was terrible, that it needed to be saved.
It was almost guaranteed to fail.
That all of the changes made were the choices of the editors and not Lucas himself.
This scene was never intended to be Luke's introduction,
despite any evidence to the contrary. That all changes were invariably and inarguably for the better.
Luke does another run.
So much so that they individually and collectively improved the film so vastly that Star Wars would have been a flop without them.
Be sure to check out our Film School channel right over here for more filmmaking tutorials.
Rocket Jump's video is not a tutorial, it's not educational, it's simply an attempt to discredit George Lucas, to persuade the audience that Star Wars was a success in spite of him and not because of him. That is, Rocket Jump's video is just a slightly more subtle version of this.
You know, I mean, you look at Graffiti and THX and I mean, the original Star Wars, I thought they were pretty well-directed films, you know?
They're well-edited films.
Yes, they're well-edited films,
I
sure.
think...
But...
Well, that's, yeah, there's a lot of talk about Star Wars and how it was sort of saved and edited and everything they changed, but...
Like people say the original cut of Star Wars was very, like not paced out well.
Yeah.
Didn't have a lot of, like, oomph to it. And then those guys went and edited it, and they're like, yes, okay, we have to make these scenes work. We have to... For 20 years, you know, everyone kissed his ass and said, you're the greatest, George, you created Star Wars, you created Star Wars. And secretly, deep down inside, he knows he really didn't do all that much. He started the ball rolling, you know, and the actors made it work, the editors made it work, the art department, I mean, made it work. So I propose he's a fraud from the get-go.
From the very beginning, huh?
The luckiest man in show business other than Ringo Starr.
But for whatever reason, he's continued to go back and re-edit these films. Star Wars fans are so hardcore that they've restored the theatrical versions themselves. And it was this version of the film that received the Academy Award for Best Editing.
Some fans who don't like what Lucas did with the special editions and or don't like what he did with the prequels aren't satisfied with criticizing him on these bases. They want to burn him to the ground. They want to take everything away from him, because they believe he did something unseemly to their childhood or something. That is why Star Wars was saved in the edit, as opposed to it just went through the normal editing process that all films go through. Rocket Jump's video is a collection of half-truths and lies, and if you believe that this was not deliberate with the intention of discrediting George Lucas...
He said, quote, "I really enjoy editing the most. It's the part I have the most control over. It's the part I can deal with the easiest. It's the part I can rely on the most to save things, for better or worse. Everyone has their ace in the hole. Mine's editing." End quote.
Right, here's the quote, here's the part the professor left out. The part where Lucas says he can solve problems that can't get solved any other way and how it always comes down to that in the end.
However, I think George's ace in the hole was that he surrounded himself with an incredible team of people to work with, and for listening and collaborating with them to help refine his incredible vision.
If what you want is simply to Lucas bash, then by all means watch extremely poorly researched and or deliberately misleading videos by Star Wars fans with a chip on their shoulder, and then in your wanton ignorance leave your stupid embarrassing comment about how Star Wars would have been a complete flop if it hadn't been saved by Marcia Lucas. You know, because it was really saved by Paul Hirsch. On the other hand, if what you want is to learn, why not start by reading J.W. Rinsler's Making of Star Wars? Educate yourself. Try using your brain. Then when you watch a video like Rocket Jump's How Star Wars Was Saved in the Edit, you'll see it for what it is.
What a piece of...
And you won't need me or anyone else to explain it to you.